Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy daylight savings time. Hope everybody's awake. I know we had to get up an hour early today. This is Claire McFadden, and today we're having a webinar to review the DDSD encounter data submission guidance. Oopsie. And welcome everybody. And I have here in Waterbury, my team is Brenda Heller, Joelle Judge, and Erin Flynn. And occasionally, if there's a question that comes up, I may pass the mic over to them to answer the question. But so just keep in mind, while you can hear me, I have you all muted. And if there's anything you want to say or you're having trouble with anything with the presentation, there is a small chat box in the left bottom corner of your screen. And you can type in anything that you want to ask in that chat box. So as we go through the presentation, what I'm going to be doing is stopping at certain sections of the guidance, and I'm going to give a brief overview of what's contained in that section. I'm not going to go over everything. And then I'm going to pause and ask for questions. And you can ask questions about anything that's in that section, whether I've touched on it or not. Hopefully people have had a chance to review the guidance prior to this training, and we had also sent out some frequently asked questions, and those two documents were sent out. They're also online on the Developmental Disability Services Division website. There's now on the website a section for payment reform right on the homepage of DDSD website, and there you can click on that and it'll take you to a section for encounter data, and the documents we'll be reviewing are there. So we will try to answer all the questions that come up today. There may be some questions that we don't have an answer for, and we will have to get back to you later with the answer to that. My intent is to take down all these questions and the answers, and then add those to the frequently asked questions document that's posted on the website. And so if we don't answer your question today, we will research the question and come up with the answer and add it to the frequently asked questions. And then when I post a new version of the frequently asked questions, I'll send agency staff notice that it's been posted. But you can just keep checking there if you want to. So like I said, I'm going to go through various sections of the guidance, and then at the end I'll just open it up for general questions or any remaining questions that you have. So just as a reminder, there's also two live presentations. They basically will be the same as what we're doing today, but for people who want to attend in person, we have one on March 18th in Rutland, and there's one on March 23rd in Waterbury. And then a final note on that also is, if there are additional questions that people come up with as you're trying to implement getting ready to submit your encounter guidance, or any questions at all about the process of doing that, you can send your questions to Jennifer Perkins at the state. It's jennifer.perkins@vermont.gov. So just a another side note is that this guidance is definitely a work in progress. This whole project of gearing up for the submission of encounter data, from our side of the fence, we've had to do work to set the system up so that the encounter data can be reported. And then on your end of the fence, you have to change your systems so that you can get that data submitted into the MMIS system. And we're inevitably going to find that we may have made some mistakes, or we forgot something, or we have to correct something. So just keep in mind that this is definitely a work in progress, and that additions and changes will likely be needed. And if you're running into problems as you try to submit your encounter data, please let us know what kind of problems you're running into. If you're having trouble, if you're getting a lot of denials, or any problem that you're having, please let us know and we will help troubleshoot that for you. And then one last thing I wanted to mention also is that, as you know, Dale is working with DEVA on payment reform, and DEVA has some business analysts who are available for assistance, and the type of assistance that they may give you is to help map out your process for entering encounter data. And so they've been out to a few agencies already, and some of those agencies have found this to be helpful. It's helpful to think about exactly how you're going to get all the information from those workers who are actually doing the work, and then reporting that into your system that then gets reported to the MMIS. And so there's a lot of work streams involved in that, depending on where the original information comes from. So we do have business analysts available to agencies if you would like their assistance to think through your processes within your agency. So you can contact Joelle Judge at the state, and they can arrange for the business analysts to come to your agency for some assistance. Okay, so I wanted to give you a little bit of a history of why we're making these changes. So several years ago, we've discovered that the state really does not have sufficient transparency and accountability regarding what the state is paying for in developmental disability services, and what people actually receive for services. So currently the reporting of what people receive for services is reported into the monthly service reports, but we have discovered that there are lots of gaps in the MSR reporting. Either the information is not being submitted correctly, or there's big gaps. So for example, a lot of the services that are paid through ARIS are not in there for a lot of agencies. And the monthly service reporting platform is really old, and rather than trying to fix the MSR, what we decided was that we would move forward with having the encounter data reported into the Medicaid Management Information System, the MMIS. And that way also we have both what's paid for and what was delivered all in one system. So we made that decision to make that shift. So we've had to change all the codes that are used to report data from the MSR codes to the MMIS type of codes. So then the encounter data submission guidance was developed to provide agencies with instructions about this whole new process. So I wanted to make a point that it's going to be really important for agencies to submit this encounter data accurately and completely because the first use of the encounter data will be we will be using that information in our payment reform work to help us develop the actual payment model. And it will also have an impact on our ability to adjust the rates that are paid to agencies. We're anticipating that we'll be able to increase the rates, but we have to see what type of utilization is currently happening at agencies. So it's going to be really important for us to have accurate and complete encounter data in order for us to move that forward. The second reason is that and again, this is not going to happen right away. This is probably more than a year away from now. But encounter data is in the future payment model is going to be used to reconcile payments to agencies. So what we'll be doing is we will be looking at how much was paid to agencies for services, and then we'll be looking at your encounter data to determine how much services were delivered. And then we'll be reconciling those two things. So this will have implications for agencies regarding whether funding might need to be recouped from an agency if the encounter data doesn't support the payments. So again, that's why it's going to be very important in the future for complete and accurate encounter data to become available to the state. Okay. So now I'm going to start reviewing the guidance itself. First, there's just a glossary with some definitions. And then we have the general information. So just to reiterate what encounter data is, it's a record of the service that was delivered to an individual on a specific date. And it indicates the quantity of services, and then there's additional information that we're asking for in encounters, like what's the staffing ratio, how many people were served, that we've changed the specific codes for the services, and et cetera, and we'll go into more detail about that. But basically, what's different about this is that we're moving from the MSR reporting to the MMIS, but when you report information into the MMIS system, it's just like submitting a paid claim or a fee-for-service claim, but the difference is that the encounter data will be paid zero instead of a specific amount of money, which is more typical of a fee-for-service. And just to reiterate, we will eventually be comparing what was paid to the encounter data. So another thing to note is that this encounter data guidance and the use of encounter data is only for home and community-based services, previously known as the waiver, and it does not apply to fee-for-service billing. So another thing to note is that you can stop submitting your MSR data as soon as you start reporting encounter data into the MMIS. So I know it would be difficult for agencies to run parallel systems, but we're not going to require you to continue to report into the MSR once you're reporting data into the MMIS. You can if you want to, but we're not going to require it. Another thing to note is right now we're not changing the home and community-based services definitions. We're not requiring any changes to the service documentation. You still will follow the same service documentation that is in place now, and there's no change to worker qualifications. So you will see here that there are some general Medicaid policies, billing, and forms. And on your screen, you'll see a list of useful resources that can help you with submitting your encounter data. We have the Medicaid General Billing and Forms Manual. We have a General Provider Manual. There's the claim forms, and then there's the platform known as PES. And the links to all those are available in this guidance. And so a lot of your questions about just generally submitting, these resources are good for both paid claims and for encounter data, but anything to do with entering information into the MMIS system, you can probably find at one of these links. So I just also wanted to note that the information that's in this guidance, it should be viewed as a supplement to these general Medicaid provider resources. So I'm going to pause there. Those red question marks mean that I'm opening up the floor to questions. And so if you have a question on anything I've said up till now, please type in your question in the chat box. How do I see them? Oops. Where can I see? I have to go to this, like right here, like that. Do it. Is that what I do? I'll look at yours. Okay, so so I have a question.
These are all just comments of people saying they can hear us.
Okay.
No questions related to the content yet.
Okay. All right. It looks like we don't have any questions yet. It was just about getting signed on properly. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It looks like we're getting one question. Okay. All right. So we have a question, and so what I'll do is read the questions, and then we'll see if we have the answer today or not. MSR reporting will stop for DD clients. What about sending non-billing information? Is that still a requirement for MSR? No, we're not going to require any of the non-billing information to be sent through the MSR for DD folks. I know that anybody who crosses over into mental health, that they're still using the MSR because they have a lot of need for the information that's in the MSR, and they're not shifting off of using the MSR. But for DD, we will not need that. Okay, I'll just wait a second and see if there's any other questions. Okay, we have another question. Will DS guidance and FAQ information eventually be included in the manual? Yes, I believe I've been trying to incorporate some of the answers from the FAQs into the guidance as we go along. I think eventually, yeah, we'll just try to include everything into the guidance.
And I could speak to the Medicaid manual, so hold on. Mike's
switch here. So this is Erin Flynn from Diva speaking, and I just say I don't think we'll have a need to fully incorporate the supplemental DD data, or sorry, documents into like the general Medicaid billing manual and guidance, but it is always helpful to cross-reference so that people kind of, have a no wrong door approach. So we could look into that. We also do link to our partner payment reform projects on the DIVA payment reform website. So always looking to have cross-reference to documentation in that way.
Okay, so just wait a couple more seconds. It doesn't look like there's any more questions at this point. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so section 2 of the manual talks about how the MMIS claims will be processed for encounter data. So essentially, you're going to use the same claim forms that you used to submit the H2022 paid claims. So H2022 is the service code for DS, home and community-based services. So you use the same types of forms that you utilize for the paid claims for home and community-based services. We had a question about whether encounter data claims had to be submitted separately from paid claims, and the answer to that is no. You can submit everything together, but you have the option. You can submit them separately if you want to, or you can submit them together. Either way, when you get your remittances back from DXC, they will all be together on your remittances. So what's different about encounter data is they are zero paid encounter claims. And what's going to happen is that when you submit the service code in combination with the modifiers that we have set up, the system it has been set up to pay zero for those specific claims. So, whoops, did something happen? Oh, yes, I will move closer to the mic. Sorry. Let's see. How's that? Okay, so anyway, okay, you're welcome. When ARIS fills out the for the claims that are going to be populated by ARIS, so for all those services that are paid through ARIS, ARIS is going to be generating the 837 claims file, and that's going to be made available to agencies for submission, or the agency can ask ARIS to submit that for them. Either way, but basically for all the claims where the workers are paid through ARIS, they're going to include a billed amount in the charge field, and this is going to be the amount that represents the amount the employee was paid plus the employer taxes and sick leave funds. And we need that information because because of the variability regarding how much is paid to those workers. It's not a set rate. But for agencies, eventually we're going to have set rates for each service. That has been, we've been working on that through a rate study, and there's going to be established rates for all the agencies that are paid through the agency. And we've heard from one agency that who's been doing using encounter data, zero paid encounter claims in another project, that what they do is they, in the charge field, they put a penny in the charge field, and that's just a way of helping them to account for that these are encounter data claims that they can not expect any reimbursement for. And it just helps them to sort out which are encounter claims and which are potentially they didn't get paid for something that they should have. So you don't have to do that, but it's just an idea that one agency is using to help them keep track of their encounter data. But otherwise, you can enter zero in the charge field. So you'll see here at the end it says see frequently asked questions, and there's you can flip to question 11 on the frequently asked questions, and we can do that here too. Okay, so somebody asked a more detailed question about if this is a zero pay claim, what should I put in the charge field, which is 24F, and the total charge field 28 on the claim. And so again, just reiterating what we said up above, for the ARIS paid services, they will be entering a billed amount. And for agencies, you can put in a penny if you want to help you keep track of those, or you can put in zero.
Claire, do you want to stop? Or was
Yeah.
stop recording any questions?
Yep. Oops. Shoot, didn't bring me back. Yeah. Okay. Nope. A little further. Okay. So, does anybody have questions there? Okay, it looks like we have a question. Can we submit a claim with a charge greater than a penny? I'm not sure why you would want to do that. Do you have an alternate amount that you're thinking about? This is a question from Bill Classens.
I can offer some thoughts from
Sure.
a general Medicaid perspective too. So this is Erin Flynn again with DIVA, and the only thing I'd offer is that I think it's common practice that providers submit a billed amount that's greater than what a payer would pay for that service. So I don't think there's anything we could do to change what you bill, but you're going to be reimbursed at a rate of zero for all of these encounter data claims. So do you want me to continue reading? Okay, so I think this is a continuation of this. Oh, okay, so right here. So Bill says to reflect the charge of the services. And then NCSS also chimed in and said we would like to be able to capture the cost of care by having a charge connected to the codes even if they are zero paid. So again, from a general billing perspective, that is an open field. I don't think there's any way we could restrict the amount that's included in it to say it has to be paid zero. The reimbursement rate that has been set up in the MMIS is zero for those services. I would offer Claire, do you want to add anything? I think it might be a little bit easier for the folks who are slicing and dicing this data internally to the state to have some consistency in what they're seeing. So I think that's part of the impetus for requesting zero to be included in the whichever box it is on the claim form, the billed amount box. But I'm going to pass the mic back to Claire. Thanks.
So originally we were thinking that when we saw that 0 in the charge amount, we would know that that it was an encounter claim, and that when we saw that there was a dollar amount in there, we would know that it was a claim that was coming from Eris. But we actually have another way of separating that out, because when the claims are going to be submitted for services that are paid through Eris, Eris is going to be submitting they will be using their provider ID in the rendering field. So we do have another way of doing it. So I can't see any reason why you couldn't do it that way. One of our future thoughts, we haven't set the system up right now to do this, but one thought we had in the future was potentially having that field populated based on the rates that we set up. But
Yeah, not quite. I think.
it's in another field.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Never strike that. I got advice from my partners here. That's actually in another field. So I can see no reason at this point why you can't put that in there if you'd like. Right. Okay, so another thing to remind people is to make sure that you're using the correct provider ID when you submit your encounter data. So you want absolutely make sure that you're using your home and community-based services provider ID. Otherwise, what will happen is if you put in a different provider ID from your agency, it will end up paying what's in that potentially. And of course, that's not the way that you're going to get paid. You'll be getting paid as you have been now through your H2022 home and community-based billing service code.
I think that's all the questions I see for now.
Okay. All right. Doesn't look like there's any more questions, so we'll move on. Okay. So under E, just a reminder that for these claims, just like for paid claims, you have to follow the timely filing rules, which are, essentially you have to submit your claims within 6 months of the date of service. The exception to that, both for the payment model project and eventually later for when we're going to be using this information for reconciliations, is that we're going to want to have all the encounters submitted and closed out 90 days after the end of the performance year. So I'm calling it performance year because we don't know if it's going to be fiscal year or calendar year at this point. But whatever we decide in the future is like the end of the year. You'll want to have all your encounter data submitted by that time. Otherwise, you just follow the standard timely filing rules. Well, looks like there's a question that I can see. We have a separate NPI for our waiver payments. Is this what we would use for encounter data? Yes, it is. In addition to your...
Yeah. Just Erin Flynn again, the comment I made was just in combination with your Medicaid issued provider ID for your DS waiver program.
Okay. Now we're going to talk about place of service. So the place of service is a required field on the claims. And right now we have set up a list of place of services that have to be used. Otherwise, your claim will deny. So here's the list um, of place of services. So we have 12 for home, 18 for community, 39 for adult daycare. That's adult day. Some folks have used their home and community-based services to send people to an adult day program. So that's the code you would use for that. And we actually realized when we got a question from one of our providers that there's a misalignment between the definitions of the place of service codes between Vermont Medicaid and CMS, and that's something that we'll have to work on as a state to correct. But so I can just show you what the problem is. Oops.
There it is.
Which,
There.
this one?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So this is the question we got. So you can see there's a slight mismatch. So 18 says community, and 18 in the federal definition is employment. So, but for right now, what we would ask agencies to do until we get this fixed is to use 18 for both employment and community supports, or any service that's provided in the community. 39 is okay because Vermont, in fact, has assigned that code to adult day. And 99 is okay too. It's just a different way of saying it. All right, almost back. Okay. So Eris for right now is going to just submit the place of service as home for on all their encounters. So, and then as I mentioned previously, for all those services that are paid through Eris, Eris is going to have a unique provider ID that they'll be entering in the rendering provider ID on the 837 forms and files that will be sent to your agency, and this will identify that those claims as services that were paid through Eris. And for services that are paid for through a provider agency, you should just follow the general rules regarding entering what's in the rendering field. And so if you look at question 71, we did get a specific question about that. I'm not going to flip to it, but the question was, what should we be putting in there, and do we have to actually enter the ID of a specific clinician when it's like a clinical service like psychiatry or therapy in the rendering field? And the answer to that is no, you don't have to include that. You do have the option of you can either in the rendering field, if it's not an Eris paid service, if it's all the other services that run through your agency. You can use your agency's provider ID for home and community-based services. You could use your medical director provider ID, or you could put in the clinician's specific provider ID in there as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for some questions, and it looks like we have a few questions. Okay. Are you looking to add place of service 2, telehealth, in the near future to this list? Okay, so we did have that question come up in the frequently asked questions, and there is an answer to that in the frequently asked questions. But right now, we're not sure about using telehealth for people with developmental disabilities. So, I mean, telehealth is generally used for things like psychiatry or therapy type sessions, or other clinical type services. And specifically, we think this is a policy issue. We are open to thinking about it, but we need to get some wider stakeholder input on whether telehealth would be a good thing to allow or not. I think the issue specifically is that because people with developmental disabilities often have communication issues that can make clear communication difficult to begin with, that adding another layer with telehealth may make that even more difficult. And so we just want to be really thoughtful about changing that policy, but we are definitely open to thinking about it in the future. I think this would be a good, we could have a good initial conversation with, start off with the DD directors to think about whether we want to make that policy change, and then think about broadening out the discussion to a broader stakeholder group to see if there's some support for that or not. How come ARIS is only using the home code when some of their services are provided in the community? So we are going to need to look at ARIS's system. We actually have a series of meetings set up with ARIS around potentially altering the timesheets that are used by workers, and figuring out all the codes that are going to need to be included on the timesheets. So we're trying to think about how complicated we want to make it for those workers, and to minimize the amount of errors that are made in the submission of those of the information that comes directly from those workers, because they're pretty independent, and they don't necessarily have a lot of support to make sure they're doing things correctly. So we want to be thoughtful, and we will be having a series of meetings with ARIS to develop a hopefully not too difficult timesheet to fill out. And so it's possible that we will include other services like community in the future, but for right now, we haven't included that.
I think part of the challenge too is knowing, from the data that's in the ARIS system, where the service was actually performed. So
Right, right.
Hi, everybody. This is Brenda Heller, the business analyst. I was having a thought on the question about ARIS, and I know we haven't gotten to talking about any of the data that ARIS will be supplying, but there is the option when those data files are created, each of the agencies can bring in their own data internally. And if place of service is something that you would like to be different than home, the value of home, it does give opportunity then for the agencies to scrub the data and make it what they would like to see prior to it being submitted to MMIS. Again, don't want to get into too much technology or file discussion right now, but I wanted to throw that out there.
Okay. All right. It looks like there's no more questions at this time, so we will scroll down. Okay, so this is about making sure that time is being reported according to the proper units. So you have to report the specific amount of time based on the unit that's connected to the each procedure code that we have listed in one of the appendices. And there's a general standard related to how you code something for time when it's partially through the time unit. So, for example, if it's a 15-minute code, you can enter a unit of service once you've passed 8 minutes. So you have to go past the midpoint of the unit of service. So there's a number of examples here. So for a 15-minute unit, more than halfway past the midpoint is 8 minutes. So then if you have 23 minutes, you can put in 2 units. If you get up to 38 minutes, you can use 3 units, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's examples for 30-minute code, 50-minute code, and 60-minute codes.
No new questions.
Okay.
For one additional.
Hi there, this is Erin Flynn Mediva again, and I'm sure folks who are familiar with coding on the webinar know this, but just wanted to also indicate that some of the codes we've selected for DS encounter data are untimed codes, and when a code is untimed, it's just 1 unit per encounter. So, regardless of whether or not it was an hour or 3 hours, it's still 1 unit because it's an untimed code.
Okay. So, and then I just wanted to point out that it may be a little confusing. We did get some questions on this when we sent out the guidance to begin with, but for 2-to-1 staffing, basically what you're reporting in encounter data is what the person themselves received, regardless of the staffing ratio. So if you have 2-to-1 staffing, the encounter data would just be for the time that the person actually received the direct service, but then you use a modifier to indicate that there's 2-to-1 staffing. And in our rate study, we basically when we're able to see that there was 2-to-1 staffing, there's a different rate that's attached to that encounter that's higher than your typical 1-to-1 rate. And so that's why it's important to use the proper staffing ratio modifiers. So we also had a question about, for example, case management is often provided, multiple times in the same day on the same, for the same individual, and whether we could just roll up the amount of time and report that all as one encounter for the day. And so the answer to that is yes. So I am going to go to an example about how you might want to do that. Okay, so essentially your worker, usually this is going to apply case management mostly, I would envision, but I guess it could apply to other services too. But you need to keep track somehow in your records of the amount of time that's being provided to the person on any given day. And so, in this example, Bob, he's getting service coordination, like, so we have 4 time segments in the same day. No, 3, sorry. And so you'll want to keep track somewhere in your records that, okay, first you provided 13 minutes, then 31 minutes, then 20. And then you add that up for the day. And then when you submit your claim, so in this case it would be 64 minutes. It's a 15-minute code, so that equals 4 units, and you just report that all together as one encounter for the day. And again, your rounding rules, either up or down, based on that, whether you've met the midpoint for a unit of service, would apply to these codes as well. Nope. Okay, sorry, my flipping back and forth isn't working very well. So I'll have to scroll back. Okay, so this is another chance for pause for questions. Does anybody have any questions about what I've talked about in this section?
So this is Erin Flynn with DVA again, and I just had a couple additional clarifying thoughts that I thought I'd offer while we wait for questions to come in. So per the example that Claire run through about how you would track time throughout a day and submit as a single line on a claim, I just wanted to, reiterate and really clarify that the rounding rules apply at the end of the addition. So in other words, you can't round each row up, to more units than it may otherwise be. You take, I think it was the 13 minutes, the 31 minutes, you add it all up, and then you apply the rounding rule at the end of that math. And also, I think we'll probably get into this later on in further down sections of the guidance, but we did have questions around the modifier that's used to indicate 2-to-1 staffing. And I just want to note that, we do have an appendix with all the allowable procedure code modifier combinations, and if the modifier that has been selected to indicate 2-to-1 staffing is not listed in combination with the procedure code, that means it's not allowed to deliver that service in a 2-to-1 staffing manner, for example. But I'm sure we'll get to that later on in the guidance. And we do have a question coming in. Do you want me to pass it back over to you, or? Okay.
Okay, so the question is, are you able to aggregate time in different locations, e.g. for service planning coordination? That's a good question. So we had a question on the frequently asked questions about like if a service starts in one location and moves to another, which place of service code should you use? And we had answered that question to indicate that you should use the code where the majority of the service had been provided. So yeah, I mean, for service coordination, that is tricky because you could potentially be in a number of locations.
I think as long as it's the same client and the same service, the units can be aggregated for the date of service.
Right, but if it's right.
Regardless of the location.
But then what location code do they use? What?
The one where the majority.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm just getting verification from our team members here. So I think we could apply that same rule here. So wherever the majority of the service was provided, that's the place of service code that you should use. No, we have another question.
Oh, we did skip over that one.
Okay. Two staff provide services to the same client on the same day at different times. What do we do? Do both staff code separately, or are they added to be added together? So the encounter data is about the person, not who's delivering it. So you would be adding that together to submit the total amount of units of service that are provided on that day.
And you wouldn't need to use I'm assuming in this scenario, it's just one staff working with the individual at a time.
Right,
So
right.
it's okay to
Add them up.
add those all up, yeah.
Yeah,
And you wouldn't need to use a 2-to-1 modifier.
right, right. So in this scenario, this is not where you use the 2-to-1 modifier. It's still 1-to-1 services. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. All right, so now we're going on to section 3, and this is the process for reporting services paid by ARIS. So regardless of the data source, whether it's coming from ARIS or from the agencies are still responsible for the claim submission and the integrity of that data. So, and that all that information must be submitted. And basically what's going to happen is ARIS will be generating 2 files. One is an 837 claim form, and one is an 837 file report. And so the claim form it's not in any kind of readable format, which is why there's also an 837 report generated as well, and that is something that you can actually look at and make sure that it looks accurate. And so agencies, again, they will have the option of submitting the 837 claims themselves or asking ARIS to submit them on their behalf. And if ARIS is going to be the one submitting the 837 claim form on behalf of the agency, basically what the process would be is that ARIS will send the 837 report to the provider agency. The provider agency is going to review the report. If there's no problems identified, then the agency would then turn around and notify ARIS that the 837 claim form is approved for submission, and then ARIS can go ahead and submit it. If there were some problems, then the agency would need to resolve any issues and make any corrections prior to the 837 claim being submitted. So once that got resolved, then the agency would notify ARIS that they could go ahead and that the 837 claim form was approved for submission, and then ARIS could submit it. So essentially the 837 report should be reviewed by the providers and to verify that the information is accurate. And so, when I'm talking about accurate, it's things like, does that person continue to be eligible for those dates of service? Were the services that are being reported, were they authorized by the agency? The person was still in services, they weren't suspended or terminated. I think that, there's no way that the agency is going to be able to verify, like, okay, did that worker work that day? That's not something they'll be able to verify. But, just in general, are the services authorized? Does the person remain Medicaid eligible? Or, potentially it could be something like, the volume of service that's being submitted on the encounter is way out of line with what's authorized, those types of things. So that's what you're going to want to look at. And again, I mentioned this previously, but when ERIS completes the 837 claims, the form will include a billed amount, and this will be the amount that's paid to the staff person plus the employer taxes and sick leave funding per unit. And saying per unit, because it's not per hour, because the units could be 15-minute units, they could be hourly units, the unit could be a day. So those variations occur. And then ERIS will populate the 837 claim form with the provider ID. So the provider will be the agency that's the provider. And then in the rendering field, ERIS will include a specific ERIS provider ID in the rendering field for those claims. And that's to indicate to us that this is a service that was processed through ERIS for payment. So I'm going to stop there. I think we do have a few questions.
We've got a little bit of thread going not around this section about ERIS, but going back to the example you provided about how to aggregate units.
Okay, all right. So it looks like we had some delayed questions. So
okay, we gotta go back a little here.
all right, I got to scroll up a little bit.
Okay, so
Okay. To Bill's question above, is it allowable to have multiple staff enter the services they provided rather than aggregating in that instance? So,
and then do I just read the whole thread?
okay, NCSS, let's hope so. Is the thought of needing to aggregate for time, for time same day by two different staff will result in appearance of two claims for the same day on the same service? And then there's another, so the answer is it is possible for you to aggregate units of service performed by different staff on the same day for the same individual per the example we provided. And that was a question. Yeah. It says, we do not know for certain, but it seems like it will be difficult. We will need to research with our software vendor and how to accomplish that.
I can offer a couple thoughts on.
Hi there. So this is Erin Flynn from DVAL. I'll offer a couple thoughts and then pass the mic back to Claire. Going back up to Bill's point is the thought of needing to aggregate, worry about there being an appearance of two claims for the same service on the same day. I don't think that's it. Just to be clear, I think the example we provided is more around, to be honest, the fear of, the payer perspective is that there's a little bit of extra rounding going on so that each discrete unit that's delivered within a day might, be just 8 minutes of service and rounded it up to 15, and that could happen multiple times within the same day, and then you start to kind of inflate the actual time the service was delivered vis-a-vis the units that are reported. We hadn't really thought about this from the provider perspective, and if it sounds like it's something that is not clicking or making sense to you from what your systems can do and how they tend to report out. But again, we're just looking for, instances of the same individual receiving the same service in the same date of service and how you would report that. And, the guidance that was given was around how you might be able to add those up so you don't have to have multiple lines, but that you can aggregate them throughout the same day. If somebody's jumping around from service providers for the same service, same individual in the same day, and that makes it difficult for you to report in that way, then, this might be a question we need to think on a little bit more and get back to you. Just to clarify so folks aren't getting it confused, this isn't, at least the way I'm understanding the, the question that's been presented, it's not about two workers working with the same person excuse me, the same person at the same time, but rather same person, same service, different service providers within the same day. And we're seeing NCSS say that, they think it would be a question they need to take back to their vendor. I'm guessing that means EMR vendor. So maybe we can put that as a follow-up for the providers who brought this question up to let us know, how difficult this would be, and then we can brainstorm alternatives accordingly.
Yeah, this is Claire again. I'm not sure that I don't think that we've set the system up. This is something we'll have to go back and look at how we set it up in the MMIS. But I don't think that we set it up such that if you did submit 2 claims for the same service on the same day, whether it would deny. It would, if you don't exceed the total number of there's maximums for a number of units of service, and if you don't exceed the maximum number of units for the day, I think it's going to be fine. But I want to go back and make sure that we haven't set anything up that would cause you to get a denial if you submit the claim separately on the same day. In some cases, there's like services that are like unlikely. I mean, it might cause us to have a trigger to take a look at something. So, there's certain types of services that it would be unlikely that you would receive more than one of them on the same day. Like, most people don't have more than one therapy session in a day, for example. But I'm sure there's a few other examples, but I can't think of one off the top of my head.
So, do you want me to take this on?
Sure.
Yep, so just continuing along that same thread, we did get a comment saying, yes, this discussion is about two people serving one client. Can we just use a modifier? We don't currently have a modifier set up in the MMIS to indicate, that the same individual receiving the same service from different service providers in the same day. We do have, we do have a modifier indicating that 2 staff were working with an individual at the same time. I know that there are a couple, the numbers aren't coming to mind, but there are a couple just from the general coding convention modifiers that indicate multiple services delivered in the same day. We have not at this time loaded those in the MMIS for our encounter data. As you can see in the guidance, the modifiers that are included in the key are the only modifiers that we've set up on file for zero pay claims for DS encounter data. But pending the continued discussion around this question, that could always be an option.
Okay. So it doesn't look like there's any more questions in that section for now, so we'll move on. So section 4 is about the encounter data code modifier combinations. So basically what we've done is we've replaced the MSR codes that were used to report encounter data with new procedure codes and modifier combinations that are referred to as the encounter data code. And you'll see in the appendix, which I guess I could just quickly scroll down to. Here, oh, too fast. Here are some of the modifiers that are set up in the system, and we'll go into a little more detail a little bit later. And then we have in another appendix, these are the encounter data modifier codes and modifier combinations. So you'll see there's, for service coordination, this is your procedure code. That's the old MSR code. You'll be using your HCBS provider number. And then the first modifier is HW, and the HW signifies that this is a developmental service, home and community-based services service that's being delivered. And then modifier 2 relates to the staffing ratios. And then modifier 3, for right now, we've included modifiers U3 through U5 for shared living, different types of shared living homes, but we're not using that at this point, but we did program them into the system. And then you'll see a third appendices. Oop. Okay, this is the inclusive list of the code modifier combinations. So what's really important here is to realize that if you do not use one of the combinations that's on this list, so the procedure code with one of these modifiers, then your claim will deny. So what's entered on a claim has to include the procedure code. Every claim is going to have HW to signify that it's a home and community-based developmental service, and then you have to include a second modifier, and which one you choose depends on what it means, but you do have to include those in order for the claim to process. So, all right, I'm going to go back up. Okay. So again, for quality purposes, we have built into the MMIS some limitations for codes. So for a daily code, so if it's a code, a daily code means that the unit of service is a 24-hour period. So in that case, you can only enter one code per 24-hour period. Otherwise, the claim will deny. For hourly codes, you can't enter more than 24 units in a day. For 30-minute codes, 48 units, and for 15-minute codes, no more than 96 units. And just as an aside, we potentially in the future we may put like different maximums on certain services, but right now we haven't put those into the system to limit the number of units of service other than this, except for we're putting in a code for service coordination that you won't be able to exceed 32 units in a day, which is 8 hours of service coordination, which we have a hard time imagining that anyone would provide more than 8 hours of service coordination in a day. So, but other than that, the maximums are limited by what you see here. Okay. So, again, the claims are set to pay 0, but they're going to be eventually tied to, for each individual service is going to have a rate attached to it that essentially we're going to be pricing each service, and this is connected to a rate study that was completed, and we are not set on the rates that were identified in that rate study at this point. We have to wait until we get the encounter data to determine whether we can use those new rates, but at some point when we implement the new payment model, each service will have an established uniform rate that is tied to each encounter. And again, and we will be using the encounter data to reconcile what we paid you based on those rates. So that's why it's going to be really important to make sure that your encounters are correct and that you've used the correct modifiers so that you make sure that you're getting paid the right amount of money. when we get down to reconciliation. So again, you'll use your HCBS provider ID to submit all your DDSD encounter claims in the provider in who's the provider box. Only the procedure code modifier combinations outlined in Appendix D will be accepted, otherwise your claim will deny. And the order matters, so you have to do them in the order that's specified in Appendix D. So again, it's a three-part combination. You have your provider ID, the procedure code for the service that's being delivered, and the appropriate modifiers that need to be attached to that procedure code. So when those things are all presented included in your encounter, it will recognize that claim as an encounter and it will pay 0. If anything is missing, the claim will end up being denied. So I'm going to pause there for questions. Do I have any? No. I'll just wait another 30 seconds to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. And okay, so Section 5 is about the reportable information changes. And some of the changes are that you need to make sure that your encounter data is reported by the day. And the only exception to this, and hopefully I'm not going to confuse you with this, but so for all of the services, you have to report your data by the day in which the service was delivered. I know that a lot of people currently, when they're submitting their HCBS claims for payment, they'll use a date range. So I know a lot of people bill every 2 weeks. So people will say, this is for a paid claim, January 1st to January 15th, and then they'll just put in the 15 days are the units of service. And so because the home and community-based services billing is a daily rate, it's likely the same every day. That type of using a date range and then just putting in the units of services works. But for the encounter data, for a lot of the services that are provided by 15-minute units or by the hour, you can't do it that way. You have to actually enter the data by the day and then the number of units that were provided by that day. So again, the only exception would be, for example, there are some 24-hour services like some of the residential services like shared living or group home, where a person is getting continuous service with no interruption from day to day over the course of a date range. In that case, you could continue to use a date range for entering the encounter and then putting in the number of days when the unit is a day across that encounter. Keeping in mind again that the encounters have to reflect the date the service was actually delivered, not when, like for example with ARIS, for ARIS paid claims, not when the staff are paid, but when the service was actually delivered. So number 6 is about when a service crosses the midnight threshold and how you would report those. So if it's a time-based code, like by the hour, by the 15-minute unit, by the 30-minute unit, those type of time-based codes, what you would do is reflect the number of units that are provided on the first day. So in this example, the person worked from 9 o'clock at night till 8 o'clock the next morning, and they're providing hourly respite. And so you put in the number of units that they worked on the first day for one encounter submission claim, and then you start the clock at midnight for the next day, and you put the number of units that the person worked on the following day. So what would be different though is if the unit of service is a day, then you don't have to split it up, and you just report the date of service as the date when the service started. So you would, if somebody started at 5 o'clock one day and worked till 5 o'clock the next day, you would just use the first date of service with the unit being 1. And then the other important thing is that you must only report those activities which meet the definition of a reportable action in the encounter data claims. So what's reportable and what's not reportable is all outlined in Appendix C, and we're going to go over that briefly in a little bit. But basically, the amount of time for the units of service are only for those activities that are reportable. And then number 9, it's also important to remember that you report the service by what service the person's actually receiving, not by the title of the person who's delivering it. So for example, if a service coordinator fills in for like a direct service provider like community support worker or employment supports, the encounter should be reported by the service that was received by the person. So like community supports or employment supports that the person actually received, not by the title of the service coordinator. So we're going to go ahead and pause right there and see if there's any questions. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to just keep going because we got about another half an hour, so may as well carry on. Okay, now we're moving into what you do regarding denials. So generally, you're going to follow the regular procedure that you follow for any type of denial. It's the same as if it was a paid claim. And so you just look at your general provider manual. There's a link to that here to see how you handle denials. And there are also, there's a DXE call center, and there are representatives assigned to every agency, and those people can also assist you with working your way through any denied claims. So there's a link here to who your provider rep is, and so you could, if you don't know who your rep is, you can just click there and see who your rep is that is available to answer questions. So just making a point about if the denial relates to a service that was delivered through the agency would be responsible for resolving the denial and troubleshooting that. And then if it's for a service that was paid for through ERIS, the agency is still going to be responsible for the resolution of that denial, but what you're going to want to do is reach out to ERIS and get any corrected or updated information that you need if there's something that ERIS has that's necessary to resolve the denial. So then once you have gotten that figured out or got some corrected information back from ERIS, then you can resubmit the encounter claim. Okay, so we'll stop there see if there's any questions. Okay. Okay. Oh, oh, hold on. There's a question coming in. Okay. The question is, will heirs be submitting non-payroll reimbursements, e.g. camp and mileage? Okay, that's a good question. So we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do that. We're going to need to come up with a different way of extracting information from heirs regarding non-payroll reimbursements. And so we're not exactly sure how that's going to work, whether it's going to be some kind of modifier or potentially different code or something, but that's a to be done piece of work. But it's on the list and we're going to figure that out. Okay, moving on to integrity of the documentation. So again, just like any Medicaid claim, encounter claims must be accurate and consistent with the rules outlined in this guidance and the Vermont Medicaid Provider Manual. And just like any claim, if there's any intentional submission of false information, that could be considered Medicaid fraud. So it's very important to follow all the rules regarding how this data is entered and make sure it's as accurate and consistent as possible. And just a note that while the providers are not required to submit documentation to support their encounter data reporting, they should expect to receive requests periodically for the supporting documentation on a periodic basis. This may, we're not exactly sure how we're going to do that. I mean, it could be part of your quality assurance reviews that happen at your agency. It might happen as part of an audit, but exactly what we'll be looking for, we'll work out the details of that later. But you should continue to have data to support the services that you delivered as you do now. Basically, we're not asking you to do something new and different, but just continue to maintain your documentation as is required now. And again, the DAs and SSAs are responsible for the integrity of the data, even if ARIS submits the information on their behalf. And then a final note is that, like I said at the beginning, we can expect that this whole process of entering encounter data, that we're going to run into glitches, that we may have made mistakes, and that we're going to have to make adjustments. And any questions that come in, please do call, contact Jennifer Perkins. Her contact information is here, and we will help troubleshoot anything. So I'm going to pause right there and see if there's any questions. Aha.
Yeah, someone's coming in. I think they're
Okay.
formulating.
Okay. So we have a code-specific question. Okay. So here it is. Will we be reviewing the codes below, or should we wait? I'm gonna go ahead and move to that right now. So. So go ahead and ask your question. Oh yes. Okay. Well, so good question, because yes, that 96001 we found out that it is an error, and it actually should be 96101. It and then we will be fixing that. Um, Uh-oh, shoot. Oh no. Okay, so it's not going to be 96101. Oh crap. Okay. We're gonna research the proper code and we will correct it. Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks. All right. So any other questions? I am going to move into some of the appendices. I have some comments to make on these. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move ahead here. So again, for this Appendix A, we got some frequently asked questions on modifiers, and so I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to be able to go to each of these questions to see what they were, but you can, I would suggest afterwards that you look at the questions related to which modifiers to use, look at these specific questions. So just going briefly, again, HW, that's mandatory for every claim. That indicates that this is a DS, home and community-based service. UN means that two people were receiving services at the same time. UP is for 3, 4. We got UQ, UR, US. And generally, those higher level ones like UQ, UR, US, those are used for group homes that have 4 to 6 people in them. But most of our services only allow for either 1, 2, or 3 people to be served at the same time. And then we have down below U1 and U2. And as I mentioned before, the U3, U4, and U5 are for future use, but we are not using those right now, but may in the future. U1 means the person received the one-to-one services, one staff person supporting one person. 2-to-1 is when there's 2 staff working together with one person. We did have some questions around shared living, and you'll want to look at the answers to those questions. It's one of these here related to which code you should use in shared living. So you'll want to check those out. Okay. And again, here, this is the list of the encounter data codes and modifier combinations. I'm not going to go through every single one of those, but yes, as you'll see, 96001 we have highlighted because we know we need to change that. There's a few other things that we either hadn't gotten around to finding a proper code for, or potentially that there may be some corrections, and here's a list of a few things that we're aware of that we're still working on. So at the Howard Center, they have a program called Safety Connections, which is remote monitoring, and we need to identify a code for that. There's a number of people participating in post-secondary programs, and which are kind of unique in the way that the programs are administered, and so we're considering trying to find another code or modifier for those specific programs. Okay, so this is wrong. It's not going to be 96101. We need to find another code for shared living hourly support, which is a service code that we just added last year, so we'll have to find that. And there were some questions on the frequently asked questions related to the need for some additional codes for clinical services, and they're generally codes for, there's different codes that are used when a person is a new recipient of services at an agency versus an ongoing, and so we're going to dig into that, figure out whether we're going to add those or not, because actually that may not come up very frequently. So but we know we have to try to make a decision about how we're going to move forward with that. Transportation for ARIS workers and home modifications is another one where we're still looking for a code, and there may be some other things that I don't have on this list. Certainly, if you see something missing or you don't see what you think is a code, if there's a missing code, or if the code modifier combinations don't seem to apply to a certain situation that you're aware of, please let us know, and we will research that as well. Okay, I'm not going to go into the whole list of reportable versus what's not reportable. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Okay. So just generally, when you think about reporting an encounter, what you're reporting for most of the services is what is actually being received by a person face to face, and for most of the direct services, as long as the person is there, if they're receiving like hands-on training or supervision, or they're completing their record keeping while they're actually working with the person, that is a reportable service also. And then popping up to the top, reportable actions include those that meet the service definition in the system of care plan and what's described as a reportable service in this guidance. So your encounters are restricted to those two things. Most of the non-reportable actions you'll see in what's reportable and not reportable list, most of the non-reportable things that are listed it's not that your agency is not getting paid for those activities, it's that they're going to be built into the rates that we're going to be using in the future, as described in the rate study. So in the rate study, lots of things were included as what are called program supports. So you're not necessarily working directly with the person at the time, but they are legitimate costs of delivering that service. So like the fact that staff need to go to meetings or be supervised or travel in between individuals. Those are legitimate costs that are built into the rates that are paid for each service, but they're not a reportable action. So there are a few circumstances where the person does not need to be directly with the person for it to be a reportable action. So for example, there's some consultation and training that are reportable by specialists such as behavior consultants, communications specialists, and nurses, where when they're providing training to staff, those actions are reportable. And then just a reminder about the 2-to-1 staffing. You're reporting the units of service that the person's receiving, and you'll use the U2 modifier. It's not 2 encounters, it's 1 encounter for the person, but there's 2 staff. And so the rate that will end up being paid when it sees that U2 modifier will be the way that the agency gets properly reimbursed for that. So just a note on service coordination. So many of the tasks that you see in the non-reportable section, they're being separated out now because we are preparing for addressing there's new home and community-based services rules that are related to conflict of interest, and that it's going to be required. We haven't come up with the exact solution for dealing with conflict of interest, but no matter which solution we end up with, the federal rules require that the functions of like program oversight and service coordination are separated within an agency. So what we're doing is we're pulling out some of the usual tasks that service coordinators do, and we've increased the program support cost and rate for each individual service to account for those types of services that service coordinators do that are going to be separated out. So in the future payment model, the costs will be covered, but they'll be covered under each individual service and not necessarily under service coordination. We'll be reaching out to agencies to help us with that separation of what's a program support cost and what's a service coordination cost. We don't have the complete list yet, but we'll be working with you on that and getting your input. So that should be coming up relatively soon. Again, as I mentioned before, you report that the service that's being delivered, not the title of the person delivering it. Travel time without the person is not reportable. And for crisis services, when we did the rate study, we found that the way that crisis services are delivered in each agency is so variable across the state that we were having a hard time nailing down exactly how we should structure crisis services. So we are going to be sending out to agencies a survey to ask them how they structure their crisis services. So, and then once we get that information back, we will be able to clarify the reportable and non-reportable things for crisis services. But in the meantime, that's on hold. And again, but one thing to emphasize about crisis services, it should be only reported when it meets the service definition. For example, crisis services means it's when the person's experiencing a psychological, behavioral, or emotional crisis, not when there's just like ongoing day-to-day issues that pop up. Okay, I'm going to pause right there. Do we have any questions? Okay. Also, I want to ask when this needs to be implemented, given that we are currently implementing the new system. When is the latest it would be expected to be started? So, just to clarify your question, are you meaning when is the latest that you can have your system set up to start reporting encounter data? Okay. So I understand that NCSS is working on shifting over to a new EHR, and basically we're not expecting agencies to do all this programming in their old system only to turn around and have to do it in their new system. So we would expect that while you're programming your new system, that you're preparing that new system for all this so that you can hit the ground running when you open up your new EHR. And I think you guys are targeted maybe for like June or July. Okay. All right. Any other questions so far? Okay.
Yes, there's a question. Yes.
Okay. Well, okay, it's coming. While we're waiting for that, I'm just gonna quickly, I think I've gone through everything. Let me just pop back up here. I think I might have skipped one thing. Oops. Yeah, just reiterating again here. When you enter your encounter date, it has to be one of these procedure code modifier combinations, or else your claim will deny. And I think that's it. So we have a question. Non-reportable actions. Will ERIS include these details in the 837 report? So no, they will not. They will. The only thing that will show up in a ERIS submitted encounter claim is what is reportable. Okay, so I am done going through everything, and we have about 8 minutes left in our webinar. So I guess I'll just open it up and see if there's any other additional questions that people have regarding anything that's involved in this process. Oh, is it a red dot means? Uh, we'll just wait a minute or so here and see if anybody has any other questions. Okay, it does. Oh, yes, here we go. I was just going to close it. Okay, for outside contractors for individual psychotherapy, do we bill under the agency name or rendering provider Medicaid number? Okay, so that's a good question. So if you use an outside contractor for individual psychotherapy, if that person actually can bill Medicaid, if they have a Medicaid provider number, you should actually not be including that service in your home and community-based services program. You should have that, you should just have that person bill directly to Medicaid for that service. But if if it's a non-Medicaid provider that you're utilizing, or somebody that doesn't take Medicaid, then you have the option to put whatever rendering provider ID that you want in there.
Yeah, can I?
Sure.
Just a couple thoughts.
So this is Erin Flynn from DIVA speaking again, and just reflecting some of the work we've been doing with the business analysis sessions. I would expect, or we have been hearing at least from the agencies that we've been talking to date, that there will be a need to get services delivered by a subcontractor into Encounter data, and some of the things that have come up in discussion, is what's the sort of invoicing cycle that you might, have in place with one of your vendors. What does the invoice that they give you look like? How, does it have all the information that you need to be able to translate into all of the required fields of a claim form so that you can submit it as Encounter data? But just to be clear, it is, if it's a service that's paid for by the bundle, you need to get it in the zero pay Encounter claim so that you can get credit for it. And I know we've been talking with different provider agencies that have been figuring out different ways to do that, identifying one member on staff whose just responsibility it is to get those invoices and hand key them into the system, for example. Specifically to the rendering ID field question, I think that hits back on a piece of the guidance that we covered earlier, that I think sometimes in Medicaid or other payers might have really specific guidance around what goes into rendering provider field on the claim form, for example, if it's a service performed in a hospital, there's not really specific requirements that dictate home and community-based services. So you can put your agency's DS waiver provider ID in that box should you so choose. But you will need to start thinking about how to get subcontract data and subcontractor service delivery data into the MMIS.
Hey everyone, this is Brenda Heller, Diva Business Analyst. I wanted to also let you know that in some of our working sessions with the agencies we have visited, looking at the current process that they have for invoicing with their contractors, it's actually more of a manual process, and it's always been focused on just getting the payment out the door to pay the contractor. So the challenge thrown into the mix with putting new EHRs in place and taking a look at this encounter data is really, do you have the opportunity to pull that information into your system at an earlier place than actual payment? So if you can get it into the participant's record, then you have that piece of data available to you when you're looking at overall case or program management.
Okay, so are there any other questions from folks? We just have a couple more minutes. You're welcome. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions at this point. Again, if people think of additional questions that they have after this webinar is done, or at any time while you're moving forward with implementing, being able to submit your encounter data, just feel free to contact Jennifer Perkins, and we will assist you with any troubleshooting. Again, the business analysts are available to help your agency think about how you're going to move forward with getting all this data in. We're hoping that people will start to submit their data as soon as possible based on whenever you're ready to get your system up and running and get all your staff trained in doing it correctly, etc. I mean, we realize this is a pretty big change and a substantial workload for folks, and we really appreciate your efforts on this. Also, if anybody who's on the call, if agencies could let Jennifer Perkins know when they begin entering their encounter data so that she can go look and see if there's any issues or problems with some of that data. I know that she's already looked at a few encounter claims that were being submitted. I know specifically HCRS has been submitting claims for service coordination, and they were being held in suspension because we discovered that we actually somehow the units, the maximum units of service that got set up in the MMIS system was done incorrectly. We're trying to figure out what went wrong there, but basically that it was only allowing you to put in one unit of service, and clearly people get more than one unit of service coordination today. So we are fixing that. We've got a fix already in the works, so hopefully that will get fixed really quickly and those claims will go through. And but that's why it's really important for people to start, even if you're just starting with one service code or any service that you're ready to start reporting. It would be great if you could do that. That will allow us all to work through the kinks of any problems in this process. So I hope that people found this to be a helpful presentation. Again, feel free to contact us with any questions or problems that you're experiencing. And I think we will. It doesn't look like we got any more questions, so we're going to go ahead and close for the day. Thanks, everybody, for joining.